But we'll move to the next presentation, which is actually pre-recorded, a lecture by Martha Schwendener, who will join us in person this afternoon at 2 p.m. Swiss time. But for the time being, we'll play the talk that she pre-recorded, but I'll just say a few words to introduce her. Martha Schwendener is a visiting associate professor at NYU. She's also an art critic for the New York Times. Her criticism has been published in Art Forum, Book Forum, After Image, October, Art in America, The New Yorker, The Village Voice, The Brooklyn Rail, Art Papers, New Art Examiners, and CAA Reviews, Flash Art, Paper Monument, and other publications. She has taught at Hunter College, the School of Visual Arts, Fashion Institute of Technology at State University, New York, the University of Texas at Austin, Rhode Island School of Design, and the Pratt Institute. She's also the editor of a book on Willem Flusser's published in Art Forum, entitled Flusser Essays, published by Metaflux in 2017. And she's working on a manuscript on Flusser's philosophy and its relationship to art. It's a question to which I think she dedicated her PhD. But in this talk, she will retrace the relationship between Willem Flusser and René Berger. So I think, Francois, you can start the recording.
Hi, my name is Martha Schwendener, and I'm in New York right now. And I'm going to talk today about Willem Flusser and René Berger and cybernetics and video art in the 1970s. And I have a great deal of material to cover, so I'm basically going to read, and then we can cover other things in discussion. Just to introduce Willem Flusser. The Czech-born philosopher Willem Flusser was best known for his technical image trilogy, Toward a Philosophy of Photography, Into the Universe of Technical Images, and Does Writing Have a Future? Technical images, according to Flusser, are generated by technological apparatuses and include both still and moving images, film, television, photography, computer and satellite images, or mathematically produced fractals. The camera, an apparatus that serves as a model for political, social, and cultural apparatuses, was more important to Flusser than individual photographs. The gesture of photographing reigned over the reception, reproduction, or dissemination of specific images, although the gesture of scanning images was crucial since it superseded reading linear texts, transforming historical consciousness and catapulting us into a post-historical era dominated by the superficial reading of images. However, Flusser's technical image theory was hugely influenced by René Berger, who he met in the early 1970s and who's thinking about video, cybernetics, and the communication structures of art would affect Flusser's writing in the future. Flusser entered philosophy through a peripatetic route. Born in 1920, he fled Prague after the Nazi occupation in 1939. His entire nuclear family perished in Nazi death camps. A migrant and autodidact, he never earned a university degree. He began publishing essays in philosophy journals and the literary supplement of newspapers, developing a potent short essay form. He wrote in German, Portuguese, French, and English, translating virtually every essay into another language. And he entered the art world for the same reason many philosophers do, because he gained support there and he saw art as a vital form of communication and thinking in a rapidly changing world. In his correspondence with friends and colleagues, Willem Flusser often complained that he felt exiled to the periphery of culture and intellectual life after migrating from Europe to Brazil in 1940. Paradoxically, however, he was arriving at a center of innovation that would shape his thinking. Flusser's first book, Language and Reality, was grounded in European language philosophy, borrowing heavily from Wittgenstein. However, concrete art, which attacked the colonial Baroque concrete poetry also flourished in the 1950s in Brazil, and Flusser was introduced to these new vernaculars. In particular, the formal layout of concrete art and poetry and their rigorous approaches to space and typography would impact Flusser. The gestalt, Flusser wrote, and the visual character of writing in concretist experiments are rupturing discursive thought and endowing it with a second dimension of ideas, which discursive thought cannot supply. These methods served as proto-interfaces or screens, predicting the digital revolution and offering what poet and theorist Geraldo de Campos called a new dialogical relationship with imperial languages, since concrete art was an international language and concrete poetry took very little vocabulary to interpret and understand. Most important for Flusser was the Nogandris group, formed in Sao Paulo in 1952 by brothers Augusto de Campos and Geraldo de Campos, along with Decio Pignatari, and named after a line in Ezra Pound's Canto 20. The term concrete for Nogandris took inspiration from modern architectural developments in Brazil, which attacked the colonial Baroque architecture. Their manifesto was inspired by Lucio Costa's architectural pilot plan for Brasilia, and the architectural rhetoric of architects like Le Corbusier, who had first visited Brazil in 1929, and Richard Neutra. The Nogandris devoted themselves to developing a universal poem object that would unite visual, verbal, and spoken elements of language. They also described the concrete poem as a form of meta-communication that deals with a communication of forms, of a structure content, not with the usual message communication, and based in cybernetics. The poem as a mechanism regulating itself. This is a quote, feedback, faster communication. Concrete poetry's spatial syntax resorted in a perceptual rather than a conceptual approach, which is significant when one thinks of Flusser's writing in what would be called his phenomenological 70s. There's an overlap between concrete poetry and concrete painting in the 50s, as you can see in this image, with poetry and painting adapting the same approaches to composition and, perceptual emphasis. Concrete art and poetry caught the attention of Max Bense, a physicist, mathematician, and philosopher at the Technical University in Stuttgart, best known as a founder of information aesthetics. Bense visited Brazil several times, and his approach, not distinguishing between art and science, greatly impacted Flusser. The relationship was even closer, however. Flusser also translated a fragment of Geraldo de Campos's epic Galaxias, and this is what you're seeing here, for Bense and Elizabeth Walter's experimental journal Rot. Bense also curated a university gallery in Stuttgart, where he included the work of concrete artists and poets. And people who started off as scientists and became artists through the use of technology, like for instance, these images you're seeing here. Flusser would become friendly in the 80s with artists like Gottfried Jaeger, who benefited from this idea of art generated by technological apparatuses. And here you can see that this is a pinhole structure, an image that is created by Jaeger in 1967. Ultimately, however, Flusser's closest affiliations were with artists such as Samson Flexer, who founded the first abstract painting studio in Brazil. And you can see here in this image that he was aligned with, if not completely a part of, concrete art. And this studio was a way of revolutionizing painting and allowing it to include other generations and non-art school trained people. Flusser was also very close to Mira Schendel, who created an idiosyncratic body of work that rigorously engaged both abstraction and language. And Schendel designed the cover for Flusser's first book, Language and Reality. In the same way, concrete poetry provided a new way of looking at language and surface. Flexer's approach to abstraction and Schell's emphasis on the surface as a kind of transparent screen had an important impact on Flusser. And in fact, he would use this term screens until the end of his life. The other important element in terms of art before we get to the 1970s and Berger is the Sao Paulo Biennial. The Sao Paulo Biennial was instrumental to Flusser's thinking in the 70s and the platform through which he met Berger. The Brazilian government had seen the efficacy of using art as a platform, embracing abstraction in particular as a shorthand for the advanced modern state at a moment when Brazil was attempting to achieve warp speed industrial development and gain visibility on the world stage. The Sao Paulo Biennial was an important part of this landscape, inaugurated in 1951, the second major international biennial after Venice Biennale. Throughout the 60s, Flusser had written about the Sao Paulo Biennial and served on its advisory board, but he was made technical director at a moment coinciding with the most repressive period of Brazil's military dictatorship after a successful international boycott of the biennial in 1969, championed by artists like Hans Haacke and Gordon Matta Clark. At the invitation of Berger, whom Flusser had seen in a presentation at a symposium in Paris titled Art and Communication in 1971, Flusser presented his proposal for restructuring the Sao Paulo Biennial at the Congress of the International Association of Art Critics, ICA, in Paris in September 1972. I should also say I'm a member of ICA and I am an art critic now for the New York Times. I've been a Times critic for almost 15 years, but I've written criticism for decades at this point. Flusser's idea was to move away from national representation in biennials to a communications model, engaging local schools and factories and turning the biennial into a laboratory for communication, connecting art and the public. The French newspaper Le Figaro lauded Flusser for attempting to revolutionize the exhibition and create less elite and alienating models. Quote, "Will Monsieur Flusser find enough followers to carry out his revolution?" End quote, the article asked. Flusser's proposal was met with resistance, largely because critics, including the influential writer Pierre Restany, had already decided to systematically boycott the biennial while Brazil remained under military rule. Flusser departed as technical advisor to the biennial in late 1972, more for financial than political reasons, although per his proposal, an art and communications section was installed in the 1973 edition of the Sao Paulo Biennial. A room in the pavilion was devoted to early computer artist Valdemar Cordeiro and two artists Flusser recommended, the French video artist Fred Forest, whom Berger put him in contact with, and Derek de Kerkhove, Marshall McLuhan's assistant. Berger remained more than a professional contact for Flusser. Their dialogues and Berger's ideas about art, communications, and technology began to shape Flusser's thinking. Flusser wrote to Berger in May 1973 when his participation in the biennial was beginning to fall apart. He joked, "Let me give you a short account of my activities before considering the important part of your letter, socio-political dimensions of all present existential problems." In his writings, Berger had proposed a mutation of signs, not too dissimilar from Jean Baudrillard, with whom Flusser would be associated in the 80s. In this May 1973 letter, Flusser told Berger that in a recent talk, quote, "I argued with you and against your mutation of signs, considering that you do not stress sufficiently the imperative ideological side of the things that surround us," end quote. And I should just point out that Flusser was working on a book of a phenomenology of everyday objects, including rugs, glasses, canes, all kinds of everyday objects that he called things that surround us. Moreover, Flusser wrote to Berger, maybe one day we can make, the two of us, a theory of communication against McLuhan, and also in some sense in conflict with Abraham Moll. You see, you from the point of view of the media, and I from the point of view of the phenomenologically conscious receiver. We write books and articles, give lectures, try to change biennials and ICAs and other typical apparatus monsters, and migrate all over the world, instead of sitting down and working out a strategy for our action. You see, I am a good pupil. And that, in a sense, sums up Flusser's, his thought about Berger in the early 70s. Following Berger, video would become instrumental in the development of Flusser's thinking in the 70s. Berger provided an introduction to Fred Forest, one of the first artists in France to acquire a portable Sony Portapak, and whom Flusser would recommend for that important 1973 Sao Paulo biennial. Forest came to larger attention when he created the Space Media Project, in which he was granted space, free of charge, in newspapers. On the front page of the Parisian newspaper Le Monde in 1972, Forest inserted a blank space in the lower, you can see right-hand corner here, asking readers to fill it with their own artwork or comments and return it to him for exhibition. Flusser wrote about this work and recommended Forest for the Art and Communications section of the 1973 12th edition of the Sao Paulo Biennial. These are examples of an exhibition in Paris at the Centre Pompidou that I took, and so that's why these are not very elegant photographs, the ones coming up. And these show the space media projects from various newspapers. For the biennial, Forest presented another space media work in Brazilian newspapers. And here are some of the variations on this that you can see exhibited in the earlier image. And here we have space media space media extracts from various newspapers. Okay, and also for the biennial, Forest created this work, The City Invaded by Blank Space, 1973, in which he hired people from an agency specializing in street advertising to walk through Sao Paulo, carrying blank placards, thus defying the military government's restrictions on free speech and public assembly. Inside the biennial's exhibition space, Forest set up a bank of telephones where visitors could call in from all over Brazil and leave messages to be broadcast by loudspeaker throughout the venue. Officers from Sao Paulo's Department of, or I should say Brazil's Department of Political and Social Order, were sent to shut down Forest's exhibition. The artist was held and released only with the help of the French embassy and biennial officials. However, by coaxing the secret police to arrest an artist in public, Forest demonstrated how the biennial was only a facade for a repressive regime. Back in France, Forest used his Sony Portapak to make what he called dialogical, which is a word that becomes important for Flusser, dialogical videos that promoted video as a form of two-way communication. Flusser participated as a critic observer, that's in quotes, in Forest's Video Third Age, a series of video interviews made at a French retirement home. He also participated in Archaeology of the Present in Paris, where Flusser walked up one side of the street, describing the walls, shops, doors, and windows, while Pierre Restany did the same on the other side of the street. The two recordings were played on a loop inside the gallery, with video acting as intermediary between the street and the indoor gallery space. Pierre Berger, I should say too, was one of the interlocutors, but not one of the main two walking up and down the street. Flusser played an even more central role in Gestures of the Professor. For this video, Flusser lectured on his developing philosophy of gestures, while Forest videotaped him. Flusser would later write that Frohast visited him in his garden on a hot afternoon in 1974, and he explained his thesis that if one could decode the significance of the human gestures, one, quote, one would find the significance of humans being in the world. Here, the phenomenology, of course. Flusser spoke on camera while Frohast responded to his gestures, both realizing that the camera itself affected the exchange. Let's see. This is what, and here's an excerpt from that video. Flusser says, "I would like to write a general theory of the human gesture, but as I told you, I found out that traditional media like books or essays in learned publications are not suitable for my purpose, because the structure of the media is in disagreement with the structure of the phenomenon in which I want to capture. But now we have video. Video seems to be, at least if looked at from the outside, an ideal medium to transmit a theory of the human gesture, because the video is in the same time-space continuum in which the concrete phenomenon of the gesture goes on. You are watching me gesturing, and at the same time, you are watching me proposing to you a theory of the gestures I am doing." The association with Frohast in this project helped shape Flusser's lecture series, The Phenomena of Communication, 1975 and 76, and his collected, his essay collection, Gestures. Gestures, and particularly the gesture of video, is one that's included here, which he began writing. He began writing this book in the 70s, and it would inform his technical image writings. In the gesture of video, Flusser acknowledges that video is a relatively new tool whose purpose is to serve television, repurposed dialogically to produce an event rather than merely record it, resulting in a new way of being in the world. And I should just point out, as hopefully most of us know, this book, which Adina co-edited, includes an interview with Fred Frohast. And so you can see some of the overlap here. Flusser and Berger paralleled each other in thinking about video and television. The book edited by Adina, as I mentioned, includes this interview. Some of Flusser's most important pivotal essays were written during the period when he was most closely associated with Berger. In Line and Surface from 1973, Flusser argued that surfaces are becoming more important than lines, linear text, in terms of how information is read and understood, since surfaces can be perceived more quickly, which changes our notion of time and cognition. And hopefully you can see here the impact of concrete poetry and its idea of superficial reading instead of linear reading. And that's why I opened this lecture with that discussion. Based on this essay, Line and Surface from 1973, Flusser was invited to participate in Open Circuits, an international conference on the future of television, held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, organized by Gerald O'Grady, founder of the University at Buffalo's Center for Media Study. Flusser's paper, Two Approaches to the Phenomenon Television, considered television from a phenomenological perspective as a box in the living room around which people sit, pressing buttons that give them the illusion of freedom and control. Flusser argues that television is a new window onto the world, an updated version of the ancient window people leaned out of in villages to communicate with their neighbors. For television to become an improved window or a less passive window, however, it needs not merely to transmit messages, but to allow us to see and recognize other people. Berger, of course, also participated in Open Circuits, describing in his lecture different levels of television. The macro television, which is a mass media, which is the mass media television broadcasting, meso television, which comprises local and community television, and micro television, which includes the portable video camera. Berger argued that while television seems like a novel phenomenon, It's really just recreating the ritual and myth of earlier eras, a new system of common reference. Here's a quote from that essay. Now we can see why TV should have become invested with such power. It is TV which makes visible the shape of the event. It is TV which pouts before our eyes. An image, I think that's supposed to be posit, sorry, I typed that in myself, an image of what we are. By extending the theories of Dumézil, it would surely be easy to show that broadcasts fulfill the three great social functions which he distinguished and discovered in various civilizations: sovereignty, armed force, and fertility. Perhaps it would be appropriate to add to these the partly new functions which have appeared in our era: accident and breakdown. These ideas, and particularly the notion of images shaping events, would reverberate through Flusser's writings in the 80s. Flusser would continue to communicate with Fred Forest, who would make works in the 80s like How to Watch Television in 1984. One of Flusser's most fruitful dialogues, however, was with the artist Herman Faraki, with whom he would collaborate on the video Catch Words, Catch Images, an interview with Willem Flusser, in which the two discuss the relationship between text and images on the cover of a tabloid newspaper. Flusser also wrote about the role of television in the 1989 Romanian Revolution. And let's see, and Faraki and Andrei Ujica's Videograms of a Revolution is clearly indebted to Flusser's ideas of technical images shaping rather than merely recording events. And in this, if you're not familiar with this film, it's taken from found footage from the in many sources, but including the central television of Romania, so state-controlled television. And the revolutionaries here are inside the television station, saying that the television is with them, meaning they've taken over the television station. So this is very much in keeping with many of Berger's ideas about communications and television, but also you can see what happened in open circuits in terms of thinking about, in some sense, armed force and power in relation to television and mass media. Flusser was also in contact with somebody like Thomas Byrol, who was a younger artist this time and sent all of his images and catalogs to Flusser. There's a whole great deal of material in the Willem Flusser archive in Berlin. And here you can see, this is actually photographed from a catalog in Flusser's archive. It's actually a painting. And then Byrol had a retrospective at the New Museum here in New York a few years ago, and this painting was exhibited. But it is this funny relationship between the screen, whether it's a canvas or whether it's a television, which interested both Flusser and Berger. He was also in contact with somebody like the photographer Angela Noicke from this period in her work. This is also from his archive, and she sent him this catalog in which she documented the fall of the Berlin Wall, but more importantly, in a sense, the documenting of the documenting and the statecraft around that event. And here we have, you can see many of these images. They're photo documentary, but at the same time, documenting spectacle, media, and the creation of news, in a sense, which we can relate to very much in our moment. Flusser was also in touch with Gretchen Bender, who worked in the commercial television realm doing video editing and television editing, and is an early video installation artist. And here we're looking at her opus, Total Recall, from 1987, and you can see 24 monitors. This was obviously a kind of extreme video installation for the time, but it looks forward to many presentations that we see in the art world now. Interestingly, Flusser and Timothy Druckery Bender and Timothy Druckery contacted Flusser, and he was scheduled to participate in a 1992 conference at the Dia Foundation in New York, organized by those two, except that he was killed in a car accident after leaving a lecture in Prague, his first public lecture after leaving there as a teenager in November of 1991. Nonetheless, the images, the ideas developed with Berger around art, communication, image, ritual, and perception continue to this day. The ways in which we receive images may have shifted, but in art, the discussion around dissemination, circulation, and the power of images remains. And I'm closing the lecture here with this image by an installation work by Hiro Shiro, which many people are probably most of you are aware of. And it is an HD video. However, the video is viewed in this larger space, and it has to do with flows, which is a very current term. And you can see here the image, if you were to Google or see a Tumblr of Hokusai's wave. And so this idea of the many, many kinds of images that would result from an internet search. And more importantly, this idea of images in our current moment and the importance of images now transmitted to us by various media, which we will discuss, I'm hoping, when we have our discussion. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so yeah, if we'll have a chance to ask questions to Martha this afternoon, and I'll see some overlaps also with Maud's presentation from yesterday. But we now have an hour for lunch break, so yeah, we're running half an hour late, but the idea is to meet again in exactly 1 hour, if that's okay. And yeah, François and I will sketch some points based on the content of the 2 days, and then we will try and have a collective discussion if that's agreeable.